werewolves, creatures of the stories and accounts of werewolves throughout history. Of course, the greatest known of that being the Beast of Gévaudan. But there have been others of claims of lycanthropy, such as the Larry Talbot murders in the 1940s, the Wolfman killings, you might know them. There have also been other alleged reports of supposed werewolves. Another notable one I'd like to bring up is that of one in Scotland, where a group of soldiers training apparently came under attack by werewolves. But no case of lycanthropy has grist than that of the case of David Kessler, known better as the American Werewolf of London. Welcome back to The Monsters We Make. I am your host, Mr. Multiverse, and I am here to guide you into the darkness once again. Today, we're talking about, as I said, the curious case of David Kessler, the alleged Werewolf of London. Maybe it wasn't so alleged. For all the evidence I will present to you may prove that these monsters do in fact exist. But if you would not wish to subject yourself to such a strain, now's your chance to, well, who warned you? Before we begin, in East Proctor, once again, Britain, in a small village that it's still standing to nice homely village, much like I talked about in our of Iping. It's not anything of note. In fact, it looks like it's still lost to time. This is an image of a tavern at East Proctor, which sadly no longer stands. The bar is still there, but its name is long gone. Originally, the bar was once known as the Slaughtered Lamb, and it's going to play a big part in our story. You see, on August 21st, 1981, two backpackers, David Kessler and his friend Jack Goodman, were basically hitchhiking through Europe on their way to Italy. Jack apparently had a lover there, and David, being the ever resourceful friend, was following him along. But he insisted they travel through London for culture. Through a series of shall we say, misadventures, they found themselves in East Proctor. Now, cold and wet, they traveled into the Slaughtered Lamb. Now, we don't have a lot of... I should warn you that this story is only going to get worse before it gets better, if at all possible. So let us continue. This is an image, the only lasting image I can find of the interior of what was the Slaughtered Lamb. We will talk about the thing on the wall in a moment, but as you can see in red, that's David Kessler. In green, that's Jack Goodman, and that is the barkeep of East Proctor. At the night of 1981, David and Jack went into the Slaughtered Lamb, where they were given tea. They wanted shelter for the night, but while nothing is really known about the conversation, Jack and David were both left out like less than an hour later. They were given a strange warning to stay on the road and keep off the moors. Now, it's unknown as to what happened next. Details are incredibly sketchy. But apparently, during their travel to literally anywhere, apparently, a burst of rain came through. The two men got disoriented and themselves on the moors. Details from a man attacked both men and managed to kill Jack Goodman. David Kessler was severely wounded, but he was rescued by several bar patrons who managed to go and find them. Now, the attacker was shot and killed, but David was grievously wounded, and he was taken to a hospital in London. Now, we need to discuss the misfindings or the missing pieces to David and Jack's attacker. The coronary reports, from what we've gathered, is that these attacks were clearly not done by a man, more animal, I would say. When you look at Jack Goodman's body, the coronary report does say that there were incredible, deep lacerations to his chest, throat, and face. Only it looked less than a man attacking it and more like an animal. More particularly, it looked like a wolf. Now, when Jack arrived at the London hospital, the people from East Proctor, again, namely the patrons of the slaughtered lamb, left before anyone could get an interview with them. They merely dumped the body off of David Kessler, not knowing if he was going to survive or not, and returned back to East Proctor. They gave they even handed their own report, their own coronary report and police findings, which is unorthodox. Now, from there, what we know from medical reports is that David Kessler was in a coma for the following 3 weeks. When he finally woke up, he found himself in the care of Dr. J.S. Hirsch. This is Hirsch. This is an image of Hirsch treating David shortly after he awoke. Now, already you can probably see something of major note in this image. Look at David's face and chest. Those do not look like the nails of a human being. Those look more like claw marks. And what's interesting to note is that David's wounds healed incredibly fast for an animal attack. It's fascinating because before, Dr. Hirsch even noted in a report that he was unsure that David would last the night when he was brought in, much less stay in a coma for 3 weeks, then wake up and the wounds were basically already healing. This is our first clue that this is something unnatural. This is something that shouldn't happen. Now, we've had multiple cases in other cases, which I will just talk about one day, of these attacks. There were of other animal attacks, throughout history. Much of it follows a lot of what happened here. You know, someone gets attacked by an animal, the wounds heal miraculously, and from there, they are fully healed, but then a psychosis comes over them. But we will get into that in a moment. After Jack regained consciousness, he was interviewed by the local police. One person in particular that was put in charge of the case was a man known as Inspector Villas and his partner. They both talked to him for roughly half hour before leaving, basically saying that it was already shut. The case was already shut, and there really wasn't much to say further on the matter. It's important to note that Villas was notoriously inept at his job. And while his partner was considered kind of a fool in his own right, he did have a lot of intuition as to what happened. Now, during Jack's stay in the hospital, we come to another important person in this story, that being Alex Price, a nurse who you can see right here on the left. There's Dr. Hirsch again. Alex Price was the main charge of taking care of David Kessler. In that time, it was reported by not just Price, but also other staff members in the hospital that David was suffering visions, nightmares of various of a very intense variety. Sometimes it was believed that he was out in the woods hunting an animal. Other times he said his family was attacked by I can't believe I'm about to say this, Nazi werewolves. And then the most vivid hallucination David allegedly had was that of the decomposing corpse of his friend Jack Goodman. Now, it's interesting to note that every different case of lycanthropy, these werewolf reports, all of these werewolf reports do split off differently in this case. After this point of the animal attack, the change is different. Some people who are believers of the existence of werewolves believe that much like there are dogs, various breeds of dogs, there are various breeds of werewolves, and how people are turned is vastly different. Sorry, dear listener, I had to get some water. But as I said, excuse me, as I said, this is where these reports of David Kessler's attack led to those who believe in werewolves basically say that this leads to the theory that there are various breeds of werewolves. The reason being is because, according to what Alex Price said in later interviews by the police, she basically stated that David would be visited by Jack again and again as a spirit, and he was decomposing more and more. And he basically said that it's commonly believed that this particular werewolf, again, I'm going by theories by those who believe in werewolves, that this particular breed of lycanthrope was believed that basically once they killed someone, the victims of their lycanthropy would haunt them until the bloodline died. David is the last of this breed, apparently. And it's also interesting to note that those who believe in lycanthropy, again, going back to the various breeds, all basically in various reports say that the werewolves that are written in these reports, such as, again, going back to Larry Talbot and the quote-unquote dog soldiers incident, all of these reports of werewolves and dogmen are all very different, from bipedal to quadrupedal. It's rather interesting if you believe this sort of thing. Now, I have not talked enough about Price as it is. Alex Price, again, was the nurse in charge of David Kessler. And while David Kessler was waiting to be discharged from the hospital, he and Price apparently struck up a romance. Shortly after he was discharged, rather than return home, like Jack Goodman's body, which was given a proper burial back in the States, David not only left the hospital with Alex Price, he moved in with her. He stayed with her in her apartment. Now, since the 1981 incident, Alex Price, give or take a few interviews prior to that event, and don't worry, dear listener, we are getting to that moment. Alex Price became a bit of a shut-in. The events that follow are devastating to her. But what is known about her is that she, according to many friends and co-workers, she seemed to have almost a fetish for Americans. Many of her past lovers before David were American. it would stand to reason that she saw David as maybe not a lover at first, but more of a fetish, as I said. It's very interesting, but it is clear from all reports that she did love David, regardless how it started. It is a wild romance given the time frame, but still. Now, while David Kessler was living with Alex Price, David's maladies continued. Now, Alex was concerned for him, as was Dr. Hirsch, who was concerned for David's mental well-being. According to reports from from J.S. Hirsch directly, apparently he did travel to East Proctor and went to the Slaughtered Lamb to speak to the bar patrons, because even he saw some discrepancies within the reports from East Proctor. Now, he was shaken. He was not a believer at first of what he had heard, but he believed that between the traumatic experience of the attack that David suffered, his friend dying, and also the strange supernatural beliefs that the people of East Proctor had, David probably fell into a psychosis. At least that was the belief from Dr. Hirsch at the time. Back with David and Alex, David's maladies were continuing, but he was trying to get himself under control, according to early interviews with Alex Price. Price took it all in stride, and the two still struck up a romance. David was fearing the full moon, which was coming the following night. Now, Alex left that night for a night shift work. Left that day, for long hours going into a night shift. Whereas David was left alone. God knows what happened that night in the apartment. Was he just dreading the moon? Was he just counting the hours? Did he even think any of this was real? It's impossible to say. But what happened that full moon was the start of a brief yet terrifying experience that rattled London for nearly a decade. It's unknown what happened to David Kessler, but what is known is that the first night of the full moon in that August of 1981, a large animal was spotted bounding across several streets, seen in the backyards of several houses, and it did, in fact, take the lives of several unfortunate victims. The first of these was a couple known as Harry Bierman and Judith Browns. The two were headed to a party, and they were found in the backyard. It's strongly believed that maybe they were trying to play a joke on them when the animal attacked them and brutally killed and partially devoured the couple. About 2 hours later, off the River Thames, 3 homeless people, only identified by friends and dental records, simply known as Alf, Ted, and Joseph, and their dog Winston, were the next victims of this animal. The final victim of this night, which was roughly, if we can get the times right, roughly around 4:35 a.m. in the subway tunnels of London. The last victim was Gerald Bringsley. Bringsley was headed home after a long night of networking with other companies. In fact, his company was going to go through a merger very soon, and he was going to get a very good bonus. He just wanted to go home and sleep because he had the day off and had a bright new day ahead of him. He was happy, but that happiness did not last. Gerald was chased by this animal throughout the tunnels until finally he tripped and fell in front of the escalators ascending to the top, where the animal tore him to shreds. According to coronary reports, Gerald Bringsley, his stomach was eviscerated. His ribs were broken into as if the creature was pushing its weight on his chest to shatter the ribs, as it not only tore into his stomach, it then proceeded to attack and gnaw at his face. The other coronary reports I should add about Judith and Harry and the 3 homeless victims and their dog Winston, who was torn to shreds. All of them had similar markings and wounds to each other. All in the case of an animal going to attack. But it's interesting to note that that while they were partially devoured, they weren't fully consumed. In fact, it almost looked like some of the pieces were regurgitated. It was almost as if this animal was attacking out of pure rage and just wanted to do it, almost in a psychopathic sort of way. Now, while we do not have images of Harry and Judith and the homeless trio that I had mentioned, we do have an image, the last image of Gerald Bringsley. Apparently, a young photographer was headed home for the night when he heard growling coming from the tunnels, from the subway tunnels. That's where he looked down and saw Gerald Bringsley trip and the animal approaching. He managed to snap one shot. This was the last shot of Gerald Bringsley before he was slaughtered by this creature. As you can see in this image, Gerald tripped at the bottom and was being pulled up when the animal started to slowly encroach on him. It was also said by the photographer before he took off, when the animal started to consume and mutilate Mr. Bringsley, it almost looked as though the animal was enjoying it. The animal was slowly approaching Bringsley. It could have rushed him right there, but instead it took its time and waited. It basically wanted to savor. It felt like it wanted to savor this killing. It wanted to enjoy itself. Now, around between 7 or 8:30 a.m. the following day, David Kessler was found naked in a wolf exhibit at the London Zoo. David managed to steal balloons in a woman's clothing in order to, and then proceed to flee, where he, in a fit of hysterics, found his way to Price. The two recollected, but David was already shaken by the events. It was even believed, and according to Price herself, that David wanted to commit suicide. He also called his family, telling them that he loved them before losing his, shall we say, courage. That's not the right word. His nerve. That's a better word. It's tragic, I should add, about all of this. All of this is a tragedy to David Kessler. David Kessler, for all intents and purposes, was an upstanding citizen. According to his family, his friends, there was not a mean bone in his body. He always had a joke. He loved to drink. His favorite drink was Dr. Pepper. He loved his family. He loved the Muppets. It's tragic what happened to him. It's hard to move on. It's hard to speak of what happened next. But we started this story, so we will continue further. That night, David, after trying to harass a policeman and fleeing into the city, where Alex lost him before finding Dr. Hirsch, who was also in search of David. Alleged reports found David walking into a theater near Trafalgar Square. Now, what happened next is unknown, but some patrons who managed to see David in this theater, which was showing a porno known as See You Next Wednesday, David was talking to himself, claiming basically he thought he saw the victims he had murdered the previous night in his rattled state. Now, from there, a commotion started. Deep growling, cries of pain, all of that. When one of the ushers went in to remove David, he was brutally attacked and murdered. That's when it happened. The animal attack was fast, it was brutal, and the theater attempted to try to seal him in. When Inspector Villas and his partner arrived to see what the commotion was, the creature burst through and tore Villas's head from his shoulders. From there, the most insane rampage happened. This creature charged through Trafalgar Square into Piccadilly Circus, snarling and snapping at everyone. It wasn't from there, from the theater, it hadn't killed anyone. That's something of importance to note. It was an animal running through a city, blaring lights, screaming people. It may have not been even a rampage. It might have been just an animal seeking shelter. Hirsch and Price arrived at the scene when the animal was cornered by police. Price, for whatever reason, ran to the creature. Now, another photographer did manage to capture a creature before what happened next. This is arguably our best shot of this creature. People have said that this is a wolf-bear hybrid, which is ungodly impossible. And the animal's just proportions are incredibly off. The paws themselves are too big for a basic wolf. The jaws are out of place, and it almost has a sort of human quality to its eyes if you look incredibly hard. As I said, Alex Price went to confront this creature, claiming that it was David, saying that she loved him. For a moment, it's said by the police that were there that the beast lowered its guard for just only a moment, only a single second. But then it lunged at her. The police took aim and fired, instantly killing the creature with several shots to the throat and chest and stomach. Unfortunately, there was no wolf when the police moved in. What they saw was the body of David Kessler, riddled with bullets. It's impossible to say, or rather, how to explain any of this. How do you explain, if even the hardest skeptics I've heard talk about this, they have no explanation for how David Kessler ended up in the theater in Trafalgar Square, in Trafalgar Square, and then showed up in an alleyway naked where an animal once was. Even the hardest skeptics have an impossibility to explain that. It is an anomaly. You could, in theory, explain everything else that I have mentioned. You could explain everything else. Maybe it's some sort of mangy animal. David Kessler probably just had a traumatic experience and found himself at the same time at the zoo, and while the animal attacks were occurring. It's possible, but that doesn't explain in any sort of way the following night, the rampage in the heart of London itself. You cannot tell me that what that thing was and David Kessler showing up in the same spot and having the same exact bullet wounds that the animal had. In no way can you tell me that this animal had the same exact wounds that killed it and killed David Kessler. And how did he lose his clothes? He may have been suffering another malady, but again, it doesn't explain, because they locked the theater. How do you explain that they fully locked down the theater and did not keep David locked in there? There was no other way to get out. There was no other exit to get out. And if that's the case, why didn't the animal spare him? It's impossible. It also does not help that the coronary report was lost on David Kessler. All that we know is that he died during this animal rampage. And that's it. The police force lost all of the records of David Kessler's death and just told his family to their faces when they heard the news We don't know. He died during an attack during an animal attack. We believe he died in that theater, which is bullshit because again, we know from it wasn't just the police that were there gunning this animal down in this alleyway. There were at least 50 eyewitnesses who saw this animal and then saw the body of David Kessler before the police moved in and covered the body and took it away for a coronary report. It is insanity to have any other kind of question. And I know the past 2 episodes, there have, it's allegations and alleged acts of supernatural or paranormal occurrences. But this is the first time on this podcast where I have no explanation, no logical explanation, I should say, regarding the death of David Kessler and this animal. I can't think of anything other than it was a true case of lycanthropy. There is no possible way to say otherwise. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there was a way David Kessler escaped before the theater locked down, and he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. But that doesn't explain what happened to the wolf. I don't know. It does sound like the impossible may be probable this time around, dear listener. So I leave you with this. Was David Kessler just traumatized from the death of his friend and the superstitions of a small village? Or was he really a werewolf? I leave that up to you, dear listener. But if you don't believe, I would like to give you a friendly word of warning. If you should find yourself out on the moors on East Proctor on a full moon, stick to the road and beware the full moon. Until next time, here's to a world of gods and monsters.